So the first point I wanted to make, and this is sort of like law school in general, but also taps into why BYU as well, is that don't get too exercised about what undergraduate you're studying. Outside of some very narrow IP niche practices, it doesn't really matter that much. There's really very little, the only limitations you'll impose on your law practice is what you impose upon yourself. And that's one thing I liked a lot about BYU compared to the other schools that I saw a lot about. Was BYU has a very general sort of practitioner type model, in the sense that it's intended to be practical. It's intended for you to go out and get a job, and not with a highly specialized practice. And I think I found that to be very useful when I practiced law. So I went to BYU Law, and I started out at a small little firm in Salt Lake City. It was a boutique firm that did mostly a couple of corporate lawyers and a couple of litigators. And at the time, I was scared of the big bad law firm. It was sort of this evil, sign your soul away when you go work for big law. And, they give the rumors were they'd give you your offer letter, and then they'd give you divorce papers at the same time, just so you'd have them ready when you needed them. And as you find out, that's sort of the exact opposite the way my experience was. But I sort of shied away from the larger firms, went to a smaller firm. I thought that was better for my soul. And it was good. I ended up really actually enjoying law a lot more than I thought I would. So I really enjoyed what I was doing. And I discovered pretty early on that whenever the fun stuff, the really complicated or sophisticated work would come across the desk of one of our clients, we would lose that to one of the regional firms, or like a firm on the West Coast or New York. And so I decided that I really enjoyed doing M&A work, mergers and acquisitions, and finance and all this stuff. And I also decided pretty early on that I sort of wanted to go to a bigger pond, where the bigger firms were, where they had much more sophisticated lawyers than was in the Salt Lake market. And so my second, about 2 years out, I actually was sitting in my office, and a phone call from a headhunter called and said, asked me if I was interested in going to Columbus, Ohio. And I told him I wasn't. And then he asked me if I was interested in going to Atlanta. And I said, no, I'm not really interested in going to Atlanta either. I told him, though, on a whim, I said, I would be interested in going to Dallas, though. And the only reason why is because I like the Dallas Cowboys. That was the only reason I said that. It was sort of to get him off the phone. And he said, I don't really have anything right now in my queue from Dallas. And I said, all right, well, thanks. And he called back like a few days later and said, are you interested in going to Houston? Would you go to Houston? And I said, no, I don't really like the Oilers at the time. And so I said, it's just really Dallas. But I wasn't really thinking that much about it. But he called back about a week later and said, I'll actually have a couple of firms in Dallas that are looking. And so sort of on a whim, I gave him a resume, and all the firms wanted to talk to me. And so I then had to go home and sell it to my wife. But so I decided to fly out to Dallas. We decided, let's go out for 2.5, 3 years, just get a little more experience, and then I'll do what everybody does, which you go in-house and work 9 to 5 and that. So I ended up going to Dallas, and then that 2.5 years ended up expanding to 21 years. I just really liked it out there. I went to a regional firm for a couple of years, and then I bounced up to sort of one of the big Texas firms. We had offices all throughout Texas, and we had them in New York and San Francisco and Moscow and London and Azerbaijan and Washington, D.C., all over the place. And so now I'm at this big, 1,000 lawyer firm, and I'm doing mergers and acquisitions, public offerings, and whatnot. And a lot of people will tell you that. So one reason why I think also is why I really am grateful I went to BYU is that, when I was at this firm, I was also on the recruiting committee for about 8 years. So I stayed at this big firm, became partner, stayed there for like 12 years. And so, and part of that, as I was always on the recruiting committee because I was one of the few associates that was married, had children. And so whenever they had anybody that would come through the pipe that was married or had children, I was sort of assigned to them, and they always wanted me interviewing people. And one thing I enjoyed about, I'm glad if I went to BYU, is BYU has such a broad footprint across the country and really across the world. When we recruited, we really, regardless of what you read in U.S. News or whatever, there's really 4 law schools, right? You have Harvard, Chicago, Stanford, and Yale. And there's a big gap even between those 4 and the big group at the bottom, or the next tier. And the next tier is 20 or 30 schools. But I mean, sometimes Columbia bounce in or out, but Columbia had such large classes that there were just Columbia students everywhere. So that was not really unique. And Berkeley and Cornell, they had these schools, but other than those 4, there really wasn't that much of a difference in my experience. And what I was mostly surprised is outside of those schools, pretty much every other school was a very regional school. University of Texas had a great law school, but almost all of its graduates stayed in Texas. And Duke was a really good law school, but most of its students stayed in sort of the Southeast and North Carolina. Northwestern, everyone stays in Chicago. And outside of the little minor geographical area that those schools were in, you just didn't really see a lot of the graduates around. BYU, of course, is really quite unique in the extent that I did a lot of work in New York, a lot of work in LA and Chicago, and I was always running in to BYU law grads. They were everywhere. And I think BYU is unique in the sense that there is sort of a very overt and explicit objective of the school to send graduates throughout the entire world, frankly, and mostly within the United States. I think that if you look at the heavy subsidy that the church puts on the school, I don't think that the mission is to flood West Jordan with lawyers. I think the mission is to get students that are trained well. They have very marketable skills. They're very successful in their careers, but they're also everywhere. Right? They're in the West Coast, East Coast, Midwest, Southeast, Northwest. And so to the point that if you ever want to have opportunities to bounce and go to different parts of the country and have different opportunities, BYU is really unique in providing that type of a platform. And it's sort of a silly example, but it's true. We went down to Alabama to a football game. We went to TCU and SMU and University of Tennessee. We're bouncing all over the South, going to BYU basketball, football games, and there's always a very, very large BYU alumni base or followers at those events. And there's just almost no other schools that have that type of an alumni base and a vision. And so BYU is really, in my experience, was really effective in giving me the flexibility to bounce to some really interesting jobs outside of Provo, Salt Lake. And I found that to be really useful to me, and especially taking advantages of some of the job opportunities that I had. Particularly in the Intermountain West, I was running into BYU law grads everywhere across the country. I can count on one hand how many, graduates of the University of Utah or Arizona State or Colorado, or even like UCLA and USC that I saw outside of the little geographical locations those schools were in. And so I'm now at this big firm and I'm recruiting. They used to send me to Virginia. They used to send me to Vandy every year, Vanderbilt. And so I learned a lot about how placements happen and whatnot. And I became more and more impressed with just the ability that the BYU Law School has to both place students and support them regardless of where they go in the country. And outside of, Yale's so small, and Yale, they all just stay in the Northeast and think deep thoughts, and Chicago's sort of the same way. But really, BYU and Harvard are the only 2 schools that have, Harvard's the only school that in my experience, that has the same placement and alumni heft and almost this vision of we're everywhere outside of BYU. Those are the two schools that were often compared on just had the same vision and the same power to place their students and their alumni. So I was at this firm for about 12 years. And then I bounced, had the opportunity to go in-house. And I ended up going to, at the time, it was Match.com, which is sort of a quirky little company at the time. But then we went through a bunch of acquisitions. And by the time I left, it was the Match Group. And we had Match and Tinder and OkCupid and Plenty of Fish and MeTick. And as Dean Stewart said, all across the world. I think the market cap right now, that business is like $10 billion. It just prints money. And when I interviewed to become general counsel there, it was interesting because they are that company is a degree snob of all degree snob companies. It's owned by a company called IAC, which is based in New York. And, everyone there is Harvard or MIT or Stanford. And they really do focus a lot with a very strong Northeast focused, which they don't think the world exists outside of the Northeast except for Stanford. And people really cared about what your resume was. And yet, in the end, when I said I graduated from BYU Law School, they're like, oh, yeah, that's fine. That works for us. And so even in the area that it was really degree-centric type of a job placement, I found that BYU Law placed me on par with pretty much anybody that I was going against. Matter of fact, the year that I was up for partner at my firm, my initial class started out, if I went down the hall around the corner where all the associates were about my vintage, one end was somebody who graduated high from Georgetown. We had Harvard, Chicago, me, the #1 student from SMU, another Harvard, and then I replaced the person from Stanford. And I was the only person that made partner. And so that also, I think, tells me as well is that the quality of education that I got at BYU was exceptional. There is no school in the country that even comes even remotely close. I don't care how much scholarship you get that will come to the return on investment you'll get at BYU. I mean, the amount of subsidy that every student gets from the church is shockingly high. And I was, most of my friends in Dallas, a lot of them were BYU undergrads, but all of them went to Harvard and Duke and Stanford and all this kind of stuff. They had their fancy $300,000 school loans. We had the exact same job. And there were twice where I took jobs when I took this BYU job to come teach at BYU, which it may shock you, but I didn't do it for the money. It was like an 83.7% pay cut. I had so many people come up to me and say, I would love to be able to take a job like that, but I still can't afford it. They've been out of law school for 20 years. And the ability to be able to get out of law school with little or no debt, which a lot of our students do, to have the degree that carries you almost anywhere I wanted to go in the country, and the flexibility it gives you to do what you really want to do, I don't think anyone should ever second guess that decision. When I tell people, if they come talk to me, I'm like, look, if your lifetime dream is you have to live in Austin, Texas, and it's between BYU and the University of Texas, and that you only want to live in Austin and it is so important to you, then you should go to UT Austin, because we're not going to outplace University of Texas, Austin, in Austin, Texas, than UT is. And if it's going to cost you an extra $150,000, you should do it, because if that's what's really important to you. If you want to be a Supreme Court justice, or you want to be a law professor at a prestigious school, and it's between BYU, Stanford, or Yale, then I'm not going to tell you with a straight face that BYU gives you the same opportunities to be a professor at Yale than Yale or Stanford would. But outside of just a heavy bias to a particular region and being a law professor at Yale or Stanford, it's really hard for me if I was talking to my kids, to justify paying a lot more to go, because whether you like it or not, you're going to have to go. If you go to Georgetown, you better get a big law job, or you're going to not be able to afford a house for the first 10 years of your career, because your debt's going to be so high. And it is a benefit to go to BYU because you have no idea what you really want to do. You may go in thinking you want to work and make 180 grand starting at a big law firm, and you may get 2 years in law school and say that's your worst nightmare. And that's the last thing you want to do. And the benefit of BYU is you have that option, but you don't have to you're not forced that option just to pay off your student loans. But my experience was there's a couple of times where my job was I had to go up against the sort of the top schools in the country to get the job or to become partner. And I just found that BYU vastly outswings its ranking weight. If you look at BYU's average LSAT GPA type metric, it's sort of like a top 15, top 20 school. And that's how, in my experience, most employers view BYU. You're going to get high quality students. And going back to the first question, even your standing, they just know BYU produces really high quality law students. And so you get the benefit of that strong reputation. At the same time, you also get the benefit of the incredibly low cost, which gives you just flexibility and freedom. You can do what you want to do. And I think most people that speak in sort of harsh tones about being a lawyer or don't like practicing law, in many respects, I think that their lack of being able to do what they really want to do is what frustrates them. And they feel like they have to do a certain type of law to pay off their school loans or it's the golden handcuffs concept. And BYU is just really unique in my experience that gives you both the heft of a top school and the flexibility of not having to spending the large premium that most top schools charge. But having a law degree is so important. And these are like some of the coolest jobs out there. Like if you look at the people that Facebook are hiring to deal with all their very complicated privacy and data use practices, or Facebook or Nike will have this group in their company that oversees all of their philanthropic and nonprofit work that's across the world. They do some amazing stuff with like enormous budgets. And if you look at the job requirements there, they'll say that you don't have to have a JD, but if you do, it moves you to the top of the stack. Having a JD, and then of course having the flexibility to not have to have a $500,000 a year salary to pay for your debt kind of a thing, really, I think a lot of potential law students just vastly underestimate what a law degree, what doors these law degrees open up. And so in the career services thing, I was, and I saw this in practice as well, is this idea that there's a lot of really cool jobs that are being just really created right now, and will be, even after this coronavirus thing, will be just a whole new kinds of jobs will be created, and that didn't exist 5 years ago. And it's very rare that you see those jobs show up that if you have a JD, it doesn't give you an advantage over most other people. Just if you understand how law works and you understand how to write well and to think analytically, it just opens up a lot of doors. And a lot of people end up doing something that they had no idea even existed when they even went to law school in the first place. It's just a super cool degree to have. So much you can do with it.